Welcome to Guns, Guns, Gear, and Guns with Gary Gunderson. I am Gary Gunderson. Mexico is suing Smith and Wesson for aiding and abetting drug cartels. Oh, so are they supplying them directly? No. Smith and Wesson sells to legally licensed dealers, who sell to legally licensed gun stores, who go through a background check process and sell the firearms to customers. Some of those firearms wind up in Mexico and used in crimes. Also, when gun control advocates say the firearms industry is the only one you can't sue for liability, that's to prevent ridiculous lawsuits when someone uses a gun in a crime, though there is an exception if the company was aiding and abetting in the crime, which Mexico claims is done by selling to legally licensed dealers. If this sounds like one of those frivolous, ridiculous lawsuits, that's because it is. Oral arguments were heard at the Supreme Court, and even some of the liberal justices were skeptical of this endeavor.
I really thought, as the statute itself says, that it partially, at least, is about Congress protecting its own prerogative to be the one to regulate this industry. You know, we're worried that tort suits are an attempt to use the judicial branch to circumvent the legislative branch of government.
What it says the distributors are doing, including the one that's named in this complaint, are knowingly supplying the dealers who we know sell unlawfully across the border.
But knowledge is not enough. We have repeatedly said mere knowledge is not enough. You have to aid and abet.
Of course, that doesn't mean they will side against Mexico. After all, they also believe guns are made with erasable serial numbers that favor cartels.
They're making erasable serial numbers, which obviously are attractive to criminals because every criminal would like to erase the serial number if they can.
I have to think she heard someone say the serial number was scrubbed off a firearm and thought someone literally took a sponge and scrubbed it off. Mexico basically has taken advice from anti-gun advocates to sue U.S. companies, but as is pointed out, would Mexico allow the same for, I don't know, being a corrupt government often in bed with these same cartels?
Mexico says that U.S. gun manufacturers are contributing to illegal conduct in Mexico. There are Americans who think that Mexican government officials are contributing to a lot of illegal conduct here. So suppose that one of the 50 states sued the government of Mexico for aiding and abetting illegal conduct within the state's borders. Would your government say, whoa, your clients say, whoa, sovereign immunity, you can't sue us on this?
I can't and certainly don't feel comfortable giving away things like sovereign immunity on behalf of the government of Mexico.
Well, I understand that. So the argument basically is it's a one-way street.
No, Justice
The government
Alito,
of Mexico can sue U.S. manufacturers here for harm caused in Mexico, but one of the states here can't sue the government of Mexico for harm caused in the United States.
Mexico claims they aren't trying to influence U.S. gun laws, but they are pushing a ridiculous lawsuit and imply the ATF is underfunded.
Mexico is not trying to legislate gun use in the United States. ATF, just because of its resources, is only able to look, even every year, at about anywhere between 3 and 10% of licensed dealers and manufacturers and distributors.
You really think the ATF hasn't looked at these dealers? Mexico even uses a Washington Post article in their complaint that mentions one of the gun sellers and says as much.
And in that article, you actually have a quote from ATF that says that ATF has no basis to believe that Lone Wolf is doing anything illegal or wrong. It reflects this convoluted theory that simply because the gun is found in Mexico can be traced back to a retailer. That means the retailer necessarily sold it illegally, and that we know that the retailer sold it illegally.
There is an assumption that every crime gun that wound up in Mexico is the result of wrongdoing by a gun store, or that every straw purchase is also the fault of the gun store.
There are a number of dealers that we do know are responsible for selling a great number of crime guns into Mexico. There's the Washington Post article that the complaint mentions.
They aren't selling directly into Mexico. A firearm can be legally sold to a legal buyer who later legally sells his gun on his own or has it stolen, and that's certainly not the fault of a gun store. And if a gun store is deceived by a straw purchaser, that's not necessarily the fault of the gun store, but they don't even consider that.
As I started earlier with Mr. Francisco, we know that a straw seller is going to sell to someone who is going to use the gun illegally, because if they weren't, they wouldn't use the straw purchaser.
Sure, you can say, oh, they should have seen a sign here, but many of the so-called red flags that even the ATF director, former, has pointed out are perfectly reasonable, like buying multiples of the same gun or paying in cash. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Mexico is also quite racist, it turns out, in their argument, assuming that guns are marketed to the cartels because they have Spanish names.
You emphasize you have a number of criteria or examples. You know, the gun says this, or it looks like a military weapon and it has an American flag, and you know, Zapata's quote about better to die on your feet than live on your knees. I mean, those are all things that are not illegal in any way. And the idea, I mean, there's some people who want the experience of shooting a particular type of gun because they find it more enjoyable than using a BB gun. And I just wonder exactly what the defendant, the manufacturer, is supposed to do in that situation. You say, no, he shouldn't be marketing a particular legal firearm because they're going to go into Mexico at a higher percentage than others?
Mr. Chief Justice, I think it's not so much that the defendants are designing a particular gun. It's that what the complaint alleges is that they are designing certain guns to target the Mexican market, including the cartels. So if you take the example that you gave, this is paragraph 215. Colt produces 3 models of guns that it specifically targets to the Mexican market: the Super El Jefe, the Super El Grito, and the Emiliano Zapata 1911. These are coveted by the cartels, and you can see evidence of this as paragraphs 217, 218, 219, 220, and they are smuggled into Mexico in volume, which you can also find in the...
Do you know what the percentage of those guns that are sold in the United States compared to the ones that are found in Mexico is?
I don't know, but again, the percentage, I think, is less important than the allegation that they are smuggled into Mexico in volume and coveted by the cartels, including being found on the person of many cartel chiefs who have been arrested.
My friend also talked about 3 pistols sold by Colt with Spanish-named firearms. The notion that selling a Spanish-named firearm is what gives rise to joint purpose with cartels under the aiding and abetting statute is as wrong as it is offensive. There are, after all, millions of perfectly law-abiding Spanish-speaking Americans in this country that find those firearms very attractive, and making those firearms available cannot possibly cross the line into aiding and abetting liability. But even if it could, the notion that selling 3 Spanish-named pistols is the proximate cause of cartel violence in Mexico is frankly absurd. And
Given the lines of questioning, I think this will be a favorable outcome for Smith and Wesson, and that's good, because this type of frivolous lawsuit is exactly what the dreaded law that removed all liability from gun companies was meant to prevent. It's clearly just to make it difficult to manufacture and sell firearms. But what do you think the outcome will be? Let me know in the comments below. And if you paid attention to the arguments, were there any other points that they made that you thought were worth mentioning? If you've made it to the end, please consider liking the video, sharing it with others, and subscribing to the channel. You can also support me via Patreon with the link on the screen. Thanks for watching.